Story 1. The Woman in the Churchyard. It was late October and I was cutting through the Appalachian foothills on my way to visit my brother in Tennessee. I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere outside of Charleston and found myself on a narrow 2-lane road that wound through a town I couldn't find on my GPS. It was the kind of place that looked like it had once been something. Rows of brick storefronts, a couple of rusted gas pumps, but had long since emptied out. Most of the windows were boarded up, and not a single porch light was on. The only sound was my tires on the cracked asphalt. The church appeared around a bend, its white paint flaking, a steeple leaning slightly to one side, as if the wind had been pushing it for decades. The yard was crowded with crooked headstones, some leaning so far they looked ready to topple. A wrought iron gate sat open, its hinges rusted into that position. That's when I saw her. She was standing just inside the gate, hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. She wore a long white dress that looked wrong. Not dirty, not tattered, but old, like something out of a photograph you'd see in a museum. Her skin was pale, almost grey under the dull orange glow of the street lamp. I slowed my car without really deciding to, rolling to a stop at the edge of the road. She didn't look at me, she didn't look at anything. I cut the engine, stepped out into the cold air, and called to her. My voice sounded too loud against the quiet. No response. She just stood there, still as the stones around her. I crossed the road, boots crunching in the thin layer of frost that had settled early in the season. When I reached the gate, the yard was empty. No dress, no pale hands. The wind moved through the skeletal branches above, carrying the dry rustle of leaves, but there was nothing else. Not the sound of retreating footsteps, not the snap of a twig. I told myself she must have slipped around the side of the church, so I dug my flashlight from the car and circled the building. The beam caught the sharp edges of broken windows and the warped wood of the siding. Weeds had grown high along the foundation, tangled with brittle vines. I swung the light across the graves, reading half-erased names and dates until it landed on something that made me stop. Fresh footprints in the frost. Bare feet. They led away from the gate, weaving between the headstones, heading toward the tree line that pressed up against the back of the property. I followed, stepping carefully to avoid scuffing them. The prints were small, narrow, and almost delicate. Then, halfway between the last row of graves and the first shadow of the trees, they stopped. Not faded, stopped. The frost was unbroken beyond that point. I stood there longer than I should have, listening, scanning the dark between the trees. My light picked out the gnarled roots of an old oak, the tangled brush beyond, but nothing moved. I told myself she'd stepped lightly into the grass and I'd lost the trail, but there was a feeling crawling under my skin. Something that made me keep glancing over my shoulder as I walked back to the car. That night, I stayed in the next town over. The bed sagged and the heater rattled, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing under that street lamp, hands folded, face pale and distant. In the morning, I stopped for gas before getting back on the highway. The clerk was a woman in her 60s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and an expression like she'd seen every kind of trouble that came through these parts. I mentioned the church, just in passing, asked if there were still services there. She stopped counting my change. "That place hasn't been used in 40 years, she said. "Not since Pastor Allen's wife passed. Some folks still see her though, mostly travelers, standing out by the gate like she's waiting for him to walk her home." I asked how she died, but the clerk just shook her head. No one likes to talk about that. Best just to keep driving. I left the station and got back on the road, but all day I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. and somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help wondering if she was waiting at that gate. Who was she waiting for? Because part of me was afraid it might have been me. Story 2. The Signal at Pike Hollow. It was the kind of rain that makes everything look older. Not a heavy downpour, but a steady, cold drizzle that blurred the world into grey shapes and slicked the road in a sheen that caught the occasional reflection from my headlights. I'd been driving for hours through the backroads of West Virginia, taking the long way home because I'd convinced myself the interstate was too crowded. I told myself I liked the quiet, that winding through the mountains in bad weather had a certain charm. By the time my car gave up, the charm was gone. The engine coughed twice and died, leaving me coasting to a stop beside a single gas pump in the middle of nowhere. The building attached to it was dark, windows clouded over with years of grime. A single bulb over the pump flickered weakly, throwing just enough light to see the rain dripping off the metal awning in a constant rhythm. There was no cell service. The nearest glow of a house, or anything resembling one, was a faint yellow smudge down the road that disappeared the moment I turned my head. I sat there a while, listening to the tick of the cooling engine, thinking maybe another car would pass. None did. Then I saw it. Out past the edge of the light, maybe 100 yards down the road, a faint orange glow swayed back and forth. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't a reflection from a window or a porch light. It was a lantern. Moving slowly along what I now noticed were train tracks running parallel to the road. Relief hit me hard. Someone was out there. Maybe a worker, maybe just a local who'd help me make a call. I grabbed my jacket, locked the car, and started walking toward the light. The rain muffled everything except the wet crunch of my boots on gravel. The lantern stayed ahead of me, swaying left to right, as steady as a heartbeat. It didn't bob the way you'd expect from someone walking. It was too even, like it was being pulled along a string. I called out, my voice sounding small against the open dark. The light didn't pause or turn. I quickened my pace, but no matter how far I walked, the lantern never seemed to get closer. Always the same distance. Always moving just fast enough to keep ahead. The ground beside the tracks was soft, the rain soaking into my jeans where it splashed. I thought about turning back, but I could see the glow just a little farther ahead, and something in me kept saying, just a few more steps. That's when I noticed the end of the tracks. About 20 feet ahead, the rails stopped abruptly, swallowed by weeds and mud. Beyond that was just an overgrown embankment leading into the woods. The lantern was still swaying there, as if it had somewhere to go beyond the rails. My steps slowed. It hovered for a second, then dropped straight down, vanishing into the wet dark. I stopped at the end of the line, rain dripping from my hood, breathing hard though I'd barely been walking 10 minutes. The ties were slick under my boots, the steel rails pitted and cold to the touch. I waited for a sound, footsteps, a voice, anything, but there was nothing, just the rain and the far-off groan of wind through the trees. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe it was someone carrying a flashlight who'd stepped off the tracks. Maybe the fog had played tricks with the light. But as I turned to head back, I noticed something at my feet. An old lantern. It wasn't lit. The metal was rusted through in places, the handle barely holding together. Water pooled inside where the glass had cracked away long ago. It looked like it hadn't been carried by anyone in decades. I left it there and walked back to my car, glancing over my shoulder more times than I'd like to admit. The bulb over the gas pump still flickered, the only other light in sight. I sat in the driver's seat, soaked, trying to shake the cold from my bones. It was another hour before a tow truck finally showed up. The driver was a heavy-set man in a ball cap, probably in his 60s. As he hooked my car to the back, I told him about the lantern, about how it had stayed ahead of me until the tracks ended. I expected him to laugh, but he just gave me a long, measured look. "That'd be the brakeman," he said finally. "Died out here in 1911. The train overshot the crossing in the fog. Folks say he still walks the line, trying to warn the next one." I wanted to ask more, but something in his tone told me not to. We drove off in silence, the flicker of the gas pump bulb fading into the rain behind us. Even now, I can't decide which part unsettles me more, that I might have seen something I shouldn't have, or that it might have been trying to help me. Story 3. The House by the Railroad. I'd been driving most of the day, the kind of long, aimless drive where the road keeps thinning out until it's little more than cracked asphalt cutting through empty fields. Western Virginia in late fall has a way of looking both beautiful and forgotten. The trees bare and skeletal, the towns small enough that you can pass through in less than a minute. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, I'd decided I needed to stop for the night. I found a small roadside inn just off the main road, the kind of place with peeling green paint and a neon sign that flickered more than it glowed. The woman behind the desk was old enough that her voice carried the slow weight of someone who had lived her whole life in the same place. She checked me in without much small talk, but as she handed me the key, she said, "Don't go too far down toward the railroad after dark. Folks don't much like people nosing around there." I asked why, but she only gave me a look that suggested the conversation was over. My room was plain. A narrow bed, a dresser, a small bathroom with a mirror that had gone cloudy with age. I tried reading for a while, but sometime after 10 I heard a faint sound through the open window. A train whistle, long, distant, almost mournful. I couldn't remember passing any active tracks on the way in, but it was enough to pull me outside. The air was cold, smelling faintly of wet leaves and wood smoke. A thin gravel path led away from the inn toward the sound. I followed it past a few shuttered houses and into a stretch where the streetlights gave out. The moon was high enough to give everything a pale silver outline, but the shadows in between were deep. The whistle came again, closer this time, and I found myself standing at the edge of a set of old railroad tracks. The steel was rusted, pitted, weeds growing thick between the ties. No train had run here in years. That's when I saw the house. It was 2 stories, with a sagging roof and boards nailed over most of the windows. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze like it was inviting me in. The siding had once been white, but was now a patchwork of grey and black where the paint had peeled away. I should have turned back, but there's something about a place like that. It makes you feel like you've stumbled onto a secret no one's told you about. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rot and dust. My flashlight beam cut through it, catching glimpses of old furniture covered in thick sheets of grey dust. Everything looked untouched for decades, except for one thing. In the far corner of the room, a wooden rocking chair swayed gently, its motion too smooth to be the work of the draft slipping in from the open door. It creaked softly with each pass, as though someone had just risen from it moments before I entered. I told myself the wind had caught it, but the room felt too still for that. My eyes scanned for movement, but the shadows beyond my light seemed frozen. That's when I heard it. Footsteps overhead. Slow, deliberate, crossing from one side of the house to the other. The sound didn't fit the place. The ceiling above me sagged badly. The floorboards bowed enough that I doubted they could hold weight. Yet the footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. My throat went dry, and I found myself holding my breath. I backed toward the door, my boots crunching on grit. When I reached the threshold, I turned to look at the rocking chair one last time. It had stopped, completely still, as if it had never moved at all. The open door I'd stepped through was shut tight. There was no sound now, no footsteps, no creak of wood, just the cold hum of silence pressing in. I didn't try to open the door. I just stood there, staring at it, until something in me broke loose and I bolted for the back of the house, shouldering through a warped screen door and stumbling into the night. When I reached the tracks, the air felt lighter, though the cold cut was sharper through my jacket. I walked back to the inn without looking behind me. The neon sign was still flickering when I got there, the front desk empty, the lobby lights dim. I didn't sleep much. In the early hours, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again, that long, distant whistle. It faded into the quiet, but I couldn't shake the image of that rocking chair, still as stone, and the sound of footsteps on a floor that shouldn't have been able to hold them. In the morning, I checked out quickly. The old woman didn't ask how my night was. She just slid my receipt across the counter and said, almost absently, "Some places remember you, even if you don't remember them." I drove out of town with the feeling that she wasn't talking about the inn. Story 4. The Shadow at Bell's Crossing. I'd been on the road for almost a week by then. My plan was loose from the start. Drive south from Pittsburgh, follow back roads through the mountains and photograph anything that caught my eye. I wasn't looking for tourist spots or big attractions. What I wanted were the places in between, the towns people pass through without stopping. Old gas stations with hand-painted signs, barns leaning so far they looked ready to fall, faded advertisements painted on the brick walls of buildings no one had entered in decades. The trip was half about photography and half about seeing how far I could go before the quiet got to me. By the time I rolled into Bell's Gap, I was already running low on daylight and patience. The last stretch of road into town wound between steep ridges, shadow falling early in the hollows. It was one of those drives where you don't see another car for miles, and when you finally do, it feels strange, almost intrusive. Bell's Gap wasn't on my original route. In fact, I'm not sure it was on my map at all. It seemed to just appear out of the trees. First a weathered welcome sign with half the paint chipped away. Then a scattering of houses, most of them leaning slightly or half hidden behind overgrown hedges. Main Street was a single block, lined with brick storefronts whose windows were either boarded up or covered in dusty curtains. The only light came from a diner near the end of the row, its neon sign half lit and buzzing. Beyond that, I could see the outline of a wooden bridge spanning a narrow ravine. Even from a distance, it stood out. Something about the way it rose up out of the dark. The wood turned grey with age, rails tilting outward like they couldn't quite hold themselves up anymore. I parked along the curb and decided to walk. The air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. My boots scraped against the pavement as I passed the diner. A woman inside was wiping down a counter, the movement slow and methodical. She didn't look up as I went by. The bridge was longer than I expected. As I stepped onto it, the boards shifted slightly under my weight, groaning in protest. Some of the planks had warped, leaving gaps wide enough to see the rocks and trickle of water below. I lifted my camera and took a few shots of the view beyond. The black line of the ravine cutting through the landscape, the skeletal remains of what looked like an old coal processing plant in the distance. The mountains on either side framed it all in a way that felt almost staged, though the light was fading fast. That's when I noticed him. At the far end of the bridge stood a tall, black figure. At first, I assumed it was just a man wearing dark clothes, maybe a heavy coat. But as I adjusted my lens and tried to focus, I realized there was something wrong. The shape was solid, but it didn't seem to catch the light. Even in the fading evening, most objects pick up some reflection, some variation of shadow and highlight. This didn't. It was as though someone had taken a pair of scissors to the world and cut out a man-shaped hole. I lowered the camera and called out, my voice carrying strangely in the space between us. The sound didn't echo the way I expected. Instead, it felt like it had been swallowed by the air, dulled before it could bounce back. He, or it, didn't move. I took a few careful steps forward, the boards creaking under my feet. I tried again, raising my voice this time. Still nothing. Then the figure turned. There was no face, no features at all, just that same absolute blackness. Yet I knew it was looking at me. It's hard to explain, but there's a way you can feel when someone's eyes are on you, and this had that same weight, pressing down hard enough to make my stomach knot. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us heavy and still. Then, without warning, it stepped sideways off the edge of the bridge. It didn't stumble or fall. It was a deliberate, calm step, like there was solid ground waiting for it where there should have been empty air. I ran forward before I could think better of it, my camera bouncing against my chest. When I reached the end of the bridge, I looked over the side, scanning the steep slope below. The ravine was shallow here, lined with rocks slick from a thin stream. There was nowhere to hide, no movement in the brush, no sound except the wind threading through the wooden beams. It was gone. I stayed there longer than I should have, leaning over the rail, looking for any sign of where it had gone. But there was nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to turn back. I ended up in the diner, mostly because it was the only place in town that seemed open. The woman behind the counter was the same one I'd seen earlier, her hair pulled back into a loose bun, her expression unreadable. I ordered coffee and, after a few sips, mentioned the bridge. Bell's Crossing, she said, like the name itself explained everything. I asked about the figure, and for the first time, she looked at me directly. Her eyes were sharp, weighing whether or not to say more. They say the miners still walk near there, she said finally. Back in 24, there was an accident in the number 6 shaft. Heavy rain for days. The tunnel flooded before the night shift could get out. 23 men drowned down there. I asked if that had anything to do with the bridge. She nodded slowly. My granddad worked that shift. He swapped with another man that night, or else he'd have been in there too. He always said Bell's Crossing was where they tried to warn folks, keep them from going into the valley. Warn them from what? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the window, the street outside empty except for my car. Because not everybody who goes down there comes back up, she said finally, and not all the ones who do come back right. The way she said it made my skin crawl. I paid for the coffee and left, walking back toward my car. But as I passed the end of the street, I found myself looking back toward the bridge. The far end was already swallowed in shadow, and though I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting, I thought I saw something standing there again, same height, same stillness. That night, I stayed in a motel 2 towns over, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was back on that bridge, the boards groaning under my boots, something watching me from the other side. And in those moments before I finally drifted off, I could hear it, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps on wood getting closer. Story 5, the motel room that faces the tracks. It was late January when I crossed into that part of West Virginia, the kind of cold that seeps in through the seams of your coat, no matter how tight you pull it. The day had been nothing but grey skies and long, empty roads that wound through ridges coated in ice. By the time the snow started, I'd already been driving for hours without seeing another car. The storm moved in slowly at first, then all at once. The air thick with white, visibility shrinking until the road ahead was just a strip of black swallowed at the edges. I hadn't planned to stop in that town, but there wasn't much choice. The sign for the motel came out of the dark like it had been waiting for me, yellowed plastic. One side of the vacancy sign, dead. The building itself was 2 stories, maybe a dozen rooms in all, the kind of place built in the 70s and never once updated except when something broke. A row of doors faced the parking lot, another row upstairs. A lone vending machine hummed under the overhang, its light stuttering. Inside, the front desk clerk looked like she'd been sitting in that chair all her life. Hair pulled into a loose knot, sweater fraying at the cuffs, eyes that didn't quite meet mine when I walked in. She slid the ledger toward me without asking where I was headed or how long I planned to stay, just handed me the key to room 7 and told me the ice machine didn't work. Room 7 was on the ground floor halfway down the row. The first thing I noticed when I unlocked the door was the smell. Not bad exactly, but heavy. Like the way old books smell after decades in a damp attic. The carpet was worn thin in the center. The bedspread patterned in a faded geometric print, corners fraying. A single window looked out toward the back of the property, where the tree line ended at the railroad tracks. They were close, maybe 40 feet away, rusted through in spots, rails flecked with snow that melted, then froze again. The ties looked splintered, and the weeds growing up between them were stiff with ice. I didn't think much about it at the time. The tracks were dead, clearly. No one had been through on them in years. They were just part of the view. The way some motels face highways or dumpsters. I dropped my bag on the bed, kicked off my boots and flipped on the TV. Static on most channels. A few fuzzy stations pulling in sitcom reruns and weather warnings. The snow outside thickened until it blurred the edges of everything, the kind of storm you feel in your bones. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight. The heater was rattling in the corner, spitting bursts of warm air in uneven cycles. I remember rolling over, pulling the blanket tighter, and sinking into that half-sleep where dreams start to blur with the sound of the real world. That's when I heard it. It started faint, like wind moving down the valley, then grew into the distinct rumble of something heavy on metal. I opened my eyes. The sound was wrong for the storm, too rhythmic, too mechanical. It was the sound of a train approaching, and fast. The floor beneath me began to tremble, the glasses on the nightstand rattling against the wood. The noise swelled until it was so loud I thought the glass in the window might crack. I sat up, disoriented, heart pounding. The clock beside the bed glowed at 3:12 a.m. I pushed myself off the mattress, bare feet hitting the cold carpet, and went to the window. My breath fogged the glass as I pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there. The snow was falling in slow, fat flakes, drifting sideways in the wind. The tracks were still, half buried under the accumulation. No lights. No shadow moving down the line. No fading echo of something that had just passed. Just silence. I stood there for a long time, waiting for some sign of what I'd heard, but the night stayed empty. Finally, I let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the bed. That's when I saw him. It was the mirror on the wall near the bathroom, cheap glass in a warped frame that caught my eye. In it, I could see the hallway outside my room through the open gap in the curtains. But there was a man standing there. He wore a dark coat, buttoned high, and a conductor's cap tilted forward enough to shadow his eyes. He was perfectly still, his hands at his sides, posture so straight it seemed unnatural. His mouth was a thin, hard line. I turned, fast, toward the actual door and window, expecting to see him there. The hallway was empty, snow blew sideways in the parking lot beyond. When I looked back at the mirror, it reflected only what was really there, just me, pale in the dim light, and the empty stretch of hall outside. I didn't sleep again. I sat in the chair by the window, blanket wrapped around me, staring at the tracks until the sky went from black to grey. When the front desk opened, I went to check out. The woman behind the counter didn't ask if everything had been fine. She didn't even look surprised to see me leaving before sunrise. "You were in 7, she said, sliding the ledger back toward herself. Not a question, more like she was confirming something she'd already guessed. "Yeah," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet lobby. "Do you know if anyone's been out by the tracks?" Her expression didn't change. She just nodded once, slowly, like she'd heard the question before. "You're not the first," she said. I wanted to ask more, but the words didn't come. She handed me my receipt and I walked out into the snow. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel shrank behind me until it was just a smudge against the white. But for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the tracks, head bowed as if watching something pass that I couldn't see. I didn't slow down. I didn't look again. But even now, years later, if I hear a distant rumble in the night, my mind goes back to room 7 at 3:12 a.m. and the way the air felt right before the glass started to shake. Story 6, The Light, in Birchfield Cemetery. I was staying with my uncle in the mountains for a week, the kind of trip you promise to make every couple of years but always put off until the guilt catches up. His place sat along a narrow, rutted road where the trees pressed in so close you could barely see the sky. The air was damp and still, carrying that quiet weight you only get deep in the hills. I'd forgotten how dark it got out there after sunset. The sort of black where you can't see your own hands unless you're standing under a porch light. The first few nights were uneventful. My uncle went to bed early, the television murmuring in the background, and I'd sit out on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the fireflies wink in the weeds. But on the 4th evening, I decided to walk after dinner, thinking the fresh air might help me sleep. The road sloped gently downhill, and after a few minutes, I saw the cemetery. It was small, maybe 30 headstones, most leaning or half sunk into the earth. An iron fence circled it, the kind that looked like it hadn't been painted in 50 years, with rust bleeding through the black. There was a single gate, slightly crooked on its hinges. A hand-painted wooden sign hung above it. Birchfield Cemetery. The letters were faded, but the name stuck in my head. In daylight, it might have been quaint, but standing there in the evening gloom, with the trees clawing overhead and the wind just barely moving the grass, it felt wrong. I couldn't have said why at the time. It was just a place. But I noticed that even the bugs seemed to avoid it. I slowed my pace, intending only to glance in and keep walking, when something caught my eye between the stones. A light. At first, I thought it was a flashlight, a pale, bluish-white beam weaving slowly through the graves, pausing here and there, as if someone were searching for something. The strange thing was there was no beam, no spread of light against the ground, just a floating, glowing point. I squinted into the darkness. The thing moved deliberately, drifting from one headstone to another. My brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of my eyes. Maybe someone was out there with one of those old camping lanterns and the glass made it look off. But then it rose higher, floating a good 4 or 5 feet off the ground, swaying gently side to side like it was being carried by an invisible hand. The road was quiet behind me. My uncle's house far enough away that the porch light didn't reach. My first instinct was to step closer to the fence, to call out and see if someone answered. But I didn't. Something about the way it moved made the hair rise on my arms. It wasn't jerky or uneven like a human walk. It was smooth, almost gliding. I don't know how long I stood there watching. Maybe a minute. Maybe more. The light drifted toward the edge of the cemetery, toward me. I realized with a sick feeling that it was coming in a straight line from the far side, threading its way between the stones like it knew exactly where to step. By the time it was 20 feet from the fence, I couldn't move. My feet might as well have been nailed to the dirt. The glow wasn't harsh. It was soft, almost pretty, but it felt wrong, like standing too close to a cliff you can't see the bottom of. When it reached the iron bars, it stopped. For a heartbeat, it just hovered there, and I swear I felt something pressing against my chest, like the air itself had weight. Then, without a sound, it went out. Not dimmed, just gone. Like a candle snuffed between two fingers, the darkness that rushed in made me flinch. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I hurried back up the road, telling myself not to look over my shoulder. My uncle was in his recliner when I came in, the TV light flickering over his face. He didn't say anything at first, just glanced at me. "Where'd you walk to?" he asked. "Down past the bend," I said, trying to sound casual. "Past the cemetery." His eyes cut to me sharper than I expected. "Birchfield?" "Yeah, I saw." I hesitated. There was a light floating around in there. Thought maybe somebody was. "Don't go near there at night." He said it flatly, like a fact. "Folks get called in and don't come back." I tried to laugh it off. "Called in? What's that supposed to mean?" He just shook his head, turning back to the TV. "It ain't a story worth telling." The rest of the night, I kept thinking about the word he used. Called. It wasn't lured or led. It sounded personal, intentional. The next day, I brought it up again while he was making coffee. He didn't look at me. "People see it now and then," he said. "Some say it's swamp gas. Some say it's old miners' lamps. It doesn't matter what you believe. You see it, you keep walking. Don't stop. Don't follow." I asked if anyone had actually disappeared. He didn't answer, but I noticed his hands had gone still on the coffee pot. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up a few things. At the general store, I mentioned Birchfield to the woman behind the counter. Her face didn't change, but she lowered her voice when she spoke. "My granddaddy used to say, the light's looking for someone. Said if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, it'll know. And once it knows, it doesn't stop looking." That night, I told myself I wasn't going back. But lying in bed, I kept picturing the way it had moved, that slow, steady glide. Around midnight, the wind picked up, rattling the window. By 1, the house had gone silent except for the hum of the fridge. At 2:30, I sat up. I don't know why, I just felt aware. The air felt heavier somehow, and when I glanced at the window, I thought I saw a faint blue glow on the snow outside. By the time I got to the porch, there was nothing, just dark trees and the crunch of ice under my boots. Still, my feet took me back down the road. The cemetery was quiet. The iron fence was rimmed with frost, the grass inside brittle and white. I stood at the gate, telling myself to turn around, when a pale shimmer winked between the stones. It was further away than before, drifting near the back fence. It moved slowly, deliberately, weaving through the graves. Every so often it would pause, like it was searching. Then it turned. Not physically, it didn't have a shape, but I felt it noticed me. And once it did, it started coming closer. I stepped back from the gate. The glow didn't speed up, but the distance between us shrank faster than it should have. My legs felt heavy, my chest tight. When it reached the fence, it didn't stop this time. The light seeped through the bars like water through cloth, spilling onto the ground outside. I could see my own shadow bending toward it, stretching unnaturally long. The air smelled faintly of cold iron and damp earth. I don't remember turning to run. One moment I was staring at it. The next, my uncle's porch light was in sight, my lungs burning. When I slammed the door behind me, he was already in the hallway, eyes wide. "You went back," he said. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. He shook his head slowly. "You don't get another chance. If you see it again, you keep walking, no matter what." I didn't ask how he knew. The rest of the week passed in a haze. I left 2 days early. and every now and then, when I'm walking alone at night in some far-off city, I think I catch a flicker of pale blue in my peripheral vision, just enough to make me turn my head. It's never there when I look straight at it, but I can't shake the feeling it knows I saw it once, and it's still looking. Story 7, The Boy in the General Store. It had been raining since morning, the kind of cold, soaking rain that clings to your clothes and creeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I'd been driving for hours through a part of the mountains I'd never seen before, narrow roads curling through thick, dripping woods, the fog lying low over the valleys like wet wool. My GPS had long since given up on me, showing nothing but a blank grid with a little blue arrow floating aimlessly in the middle. By the time I rolled into the town, if you could even call it that, my gas gauge was nearly kissing empty and my teeth were chattering. The town was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings leaning into each other for support. There was a post office no bigger than a shed, a faded church with a bell tower that looked ready to collapse, and, at the center of it all, a small general store. Its wooden sign swung in the wind, the paint peeling so badly that the letters were barely readable. I didn't see a single person outside. The streets were slick with rainwater, and the air had that thick, muffled quiet that only comes when a storm has settled in for the long haul. I pulled my truck up beside the store and killed the engine. My first thought was just to get a cup of coffee, maybe ask for directions and get back on the road. But when I stepped inside, the sound of the rain faded almost completely, replaced by the faint creak of wooden floorboards and the smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly sweet, like molasses that had been left open too long. The store looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The shelves were stocked with a strange mix of things: canned goods with faded labels, mason jars of what I guessed was homemade jam, boxes of nails and screws, hand-knitted scarves, and a small rack of postcards that were so sun-faded the images were barely visible. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, giving off a weak yellow glow. Behind the counter, an older woman with steel-grey hair and a flannel shirt looked up from a crossword puzzle and gave me a polite but distant nod. "Afternoon," I said, shaking the water from my jacket. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. She hummed something in reply but didn't say much else, just kept watching me like she wasn't sure if I belonged there. I started walking slowly down the first aisle, running my fingers along the rough wooden shelves. The place had a strange stillness to it, the kind you feel in old houses where the air is heavy with years of other people's lives. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought he was just another customer, maybe the woman's grandson, standing near the back of the store by a shelf stacked with dusty tins of coffee. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He wore a white, button-up shirt tucked into brown corduroy pants that looked like they belonged in a photograph from the 1970s. His hair was neatly parted to one side, and his skin was pale in a way that made me think he didn't spend much time outdoors. He was staring at me, not just looking, but staring, eyes locked on mine, unblinking, his head tilted ever so slightly like he was studying me. There was no expression on his face, no smile or frown, just that unwavering gaze. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck lift. I tried to break the tension with a smile. "Hey there," I said, keeping my voice light. He didn't move, didn't blink. For some reason I glanced away, just for a second, to look at a rack of postcards nearby. When I looked back, he was gone. It wasn't that he'd walked out of sight. There hadn't been time. One moment he was standing there, and the next there was nothing but an empty aisle. I froze, listening for the sound of footsteps, but the store was silent except for the faint hum of the light bulb overhead. I glanced toward the back door, but it was shut tight. I turned toward the counter. "Hey!" I called to the woman, Was there a kid in here just now?" She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look up from her crossword. "What did he look like?" she asked, her tone flat. About 8, brown hair, old-fashioned clothes. He was just standing over there." I pointed toward the back of the store. She sighed, one of those long, slow exhales that carries more weight than words. Finally, she set down her pen and met my eyes. "That'd be my son," she said. Something about the way she said it made me pause. "Your son?" She nodded once. "He died in that spot, 40 years ago." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the rain tapping against the windows. I must have looked like I was waiting for her to explain, because she added, "He likes to watch strangers, but don't follow him if he leaves." I laughed awkwardly, thinking maybe she was joking, but her face didn't change. She just went back to her crossword like we'd finished the conversation. My skin prickled. There was no humor in her voice, no wink to suggest she was telling a ghost story for effect. It felt more like she was warning me about a dangerous dog. I decided I'd had enough of the store and headed toward the counter to pay for a bottle of water I'd picked up. As I laid a $5 bill on the counter, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Through the glass of the front window, I saw him again, the boy, standing perfectly still in the rain on the opposite side of the street. His clothes didn't look wet. He was staring at me with that same unnerving stillness. I blinked, and he was gone. I left the store without waiting for change. The air outside was colder now, the rain still coming down steady. I got into my truck and locked the doors out of instinct. When I glanced back at the store, the window where I'd seen him was empty. The woman behind the counter was still there, head bent over her crossword. The drive out of town felt longer than it should have. The road twisted through dense woods, the trees leaning in so close they seemed to swallow the light. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pale face staring back at me from the back seat. I never did. But even now, years later, I can still picture him as clearly as if he were standing in front of me. The way he didn't blink, the way he seemed to disappear into thin air, and most of all, the way the woman said, "Don't follow him if he leaves." As if it was the most important thing I could remember. I don't know where he would have led me if I had. I just know I'm glad I didn't find out. Story 8. The Window of Room 4. It had been raining for 2 days straight, the kind of rain that didn't just soak the earth but seemed to leach the color out of the world. The clouds hung low over the mountains, their grey bellies dragging through the treetops, and the road ahead was a pale ribbon disappearing into the fog. I'd been driving since early afternoon, weaving through the narrow, twisting roads of the Appalachian backcountry. My GPS had lost its signal hours ago, and my cell service flickered in and out like a dying bulb. The world felt closed in, the fog pressing from above, the dark wall of wet pine on either side, and the road winding deeper into somewhere I didn't recognize. It was just past 6 when I saw the light. Faint at first, it glimmered through the mist like a candle, growing brighter as I crept forward. It turned out to be the sign for a boarding house. Miller's Rest, painted in flaking gold letters on a swinging wooden plank. The place stood on a rise above the road, a 2-story clapboard house with a wraparound porch, its white paint dulled to a soft grey. Warm light spilled from the front windows, casting pale gold onto the wet gravel drive. My gas tank was hovering near empty, and the thought of navigating these roads in darkness didn't appeal to me. I pulled in. The woman who answered the door looked to be in her late 60s, her silver hair pinned in a bun, her face kind but unreadable. She introduced herself as Mrs. Miller and called for her husband, a tall man with shoulders still broad despite his age. He said little, just nodded once as he carried my small duffel upstairs. The whole place smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The floorboards gave a low groan under my weight. My room was at the end of the second floor hall, room 4. It was small but tidy, a narrow bed with a quilt, a dresser, and a small table with a single lamp. There was one window framed by lace curtains that looked out toward the dark mass of woods that began just beyond the house's back lawn. Even through the glass, I could hear the rain ticking against the leaves, the occasional groan of wind in the branches. Mrs. Miller asked if I wanted supper, but I was tired and told her I'd just turn in. She smiled faintly and said, "Lock your window. Wind'll rattle it all night otherwise." I didn't think much of it at the time. The rain didn't let up that night. It became a kind of background rhythm, steady and soft. I read for a while, then lay in bed listening to the occasional creak of the house settling, the faint whisper of voices downstairs, the far-off bark of some dog. I drifted in and out, my dreams folding into the sounds around me. It must have been close to 2 in the morning when I woke up. At first, I couldn't figure out what had stirred me. The rain was still falling, but there was another sound too, a faint, irregular tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the roof, but it was too sharp, too close. My eyes opened fully, and I turned my head toward the window. There, in the dark glass, was a face. It was pale, almost white in the moonless dark, and pressed close enough to the pane that the skin flattened against it. The eyes were wide, too wide, staring straight in at me, and the mouth was small and shut, the lips not moving. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind tried to catch up to what I was seeing, the fact that my room was on the second floor, that the window sat a good 15 feet above the ground. The tapping came again, softer now, as though from the fingertips resting just out of sight below the sill. I jerked back, instinctively, my heel catching on the quilt as I scrambled away from the glass. My eyes flicked to the corner of the room, then back to the window. In that split second, the face was gone. The glass reflected only the vague shape of my own wide-eyed stare. My chest was tight, my skin crawling. I sat frozen for several minutes, listening, but there was only the rain. No footsteps, no scrape of movement, no sound of retreating. Finally, I reached for the lamp and switched it on, flooding the room with warm light. The window looked normal, the lace curtains swaying slightly in the draft. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, some strange reflection, maybe even a branch shifting in the wind. But deep down, I knew better. I locked the latch and pulled the curtains tight, then sat on the bed with the lamp on until exhaustion won. In the morning, the rain had eased to a mist. I ate breakfast with the Millers in the quiet dining room, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. I thought about saying something about the face, but the words caught in my throat. How do you tell someone you saw a person staring into your second-floor window at 2 in the morning without sounding insane? Instead, I asked casually if there was a balcony or fire escape on that side of the house. Mrs. Miller gave me a puzzled look. "No," she said, "that wall's bare. Room 4's window looks right over the yard." After breakfast, I stepped outside. The grass was slick and heavy with water, the earth soft under my shoes. I walked around to the back of the house. The yard stretched about 30 feet before the tree line began, the wet leaves hanging low and dark. I looked up at my window. The siding beneath it was unbroken, no trellis, no ledge, nothing that could have supported a person. 15 feet of sheer drop to the sodden ground. I stood there a long time, looking up at that window, trying to reason my way through it. Maybe it was a dream, I thought, a vivid, unsettling dream. That would have been easier to believe, if not for the fact that my heart was still beating faster than it should every time I replayed the image. The rest of the day passed quietly. I drove into the nearest town, a 15-minute trip down winding roads, and stocked up on gas and a few snacks. When I mentioned where I was staying, the clerk behind the counter paused just slightly, his eyes flicking toward the fogged-up window before he rang up my items. He didn't say anything else, but the look stuck with me. It was the kind of look people give when they know something you don't, but they're not about to explain it. That night, the rain returned, heavier than before. I kept the curtains closed and the lamp on as I read, but sleep came slower. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind against the siding set my nerves jangling. I tried to remind myself that whatever I thought I'd seen was gone, just some odd moment, nothing more. Sometime past midnight, the tapping came again. It was faint, deliberate, spaced apart just enough to make my skin crawl. I lay perfectly still, staring at the curtains, my mind screaming at me not to look. The tapping stopped, and I heard the faint sound of breath fogging glass. My stomach turned cold. I sat up, my pulse thudding in my ears, and grabbed the lamp's pull chain. The light swung harsh against the fabric of the curtain, casting thin shadows, and I couldn't help myself. I pulled it back. Nothing. The glass was bare, black with the reflection of my own pale face. The rain slid down in winding paths, each drop catching the light. I stood there for a long time, the curtain bunched in my hand, half expecting something to surge into view. It didn't. When morning came, I was tired enough to skip breakfast. I paid the millers and left without much conversation. As I loaded my bag into the truck, I glanced up one last time at the second-floor window. The lace curtain stirred slightly, as though someone had just let it fall back into place. I told myself it was the wind, and I've told myself that every time I think of it since. Story 9. The last streetlight in Morrow's Gap. It was late when I found myself driving through the mountain roads. The GPS kept losing signal, and the fog was so thick my headlights barely reached a few feet ahead. I passed through small towns, each one silent and dark. No lights, no people, nothing. Then a sign appeared. Morrow's Gap. I figured maybe I'd find a gas station, but the town looked dead. Storefronts were old and dusty, the diner's faded open sign clearly untouched for years. Everything was drowned in darkness, except for one thing. At the far end of Main Street, a single streetlight burned. Beneath it stood a tall man in a long coat, his head bowed, hands in his pockets. I slowed down. He didn't move, not even a twitch. As if someone had frozen him there. As soon as my headlights touched him, the streetlight above flickered twice and went out. In that second of total blackness, my engine died. Everything, dashboard, heater, GPS, went silent. The only sound left was the heavy quiet pressing in on all sides. The streetlight came back on. He was no longer under it. He was standing right beside my window. His head was still lowered, the coat hanging heavy, like it was soaked through. I couldn't see his face. Somehow the light didn't seem to touch it at all. My mind went blank. I twisted the key, the engine roared to life, and I slammed the gas, tearing out of that town without looking back. I didn't stop, didn't check the mirrors. I just kept driving until I saw the glow of the next county. At a gas station, I finally stopped to breathe, trying to tell myself it was just a man. Maybe I'd imagined it, but even now, I can still feel the weight of him standing there, and the way the darkness seemed to follow me for miles.